Welcome to another special bonus episode of the Connexus Church audio podcast. My name is Kerry Newhoff. I'm the founding and teaching pastor at Connexus, and I loved the Problem of God series. It created a lot of dialogue in groups, but of course, there's only so much you can cover on the weekend, so we thought we would drill down for those of you who want to go deeper and answer even more questions that we didn't get to on Sunday morning. So one of the things that's quite popular these days, particularly if you spend a lot of time on the internet or on Reddit, is you'll know that there is a widely believed theory among many atheists and many agnostics that there's a Christ myth. In other words, there's a lot of world religions that have a savior who died and who rose again, and that, this is just some form of mythology. And the resurrection of Jesus, on which the Christian faith is founded, gets questioned a lot. So is it just a myth? There is a chapter in Mark Clark's book called The Christ Myth, and so he looks into that in detail, and you can follow along. But he also taught a message on it at his church, at Village Church. So Mark and his team gave us permission to share this with you. So this is a message from Village Church, Mark Clark, the author of Problem of God, and he looks at the Christ myth. Isn't the death and resurrection of Jesus just a myth? Isn't it just like all the other myths out there about a savior who died and rose again? Well, I think you're going to love this message from Mark Clark.
All right. Good morning. Welcome to Village Church. Glad you guys are here. If you are new, my name is Mark, and I'm the lead pastor, teaching pastor here at the church. Really good to have you. And we are in week 3 of the Problem of God series. Really excited about it. Week 1, we hit the problem of science. We unpacked a whole bunch of ideas and kind of challenged the dichotomy of faith versus science. That you have to retire your mind to ever become a Christian. And we said, no, that's not true. Week 2, we hit the problem of God's existence. And we said, are there actual reasons in regard to even nature, the way the stars are, the way the planets, the universe functions, the way that you and I function as human beings, to actually believe in God, that there's evidence toward this rather than it just kind of being a crutch that we believe, in difficult times. And we explored that. And this week we hit something very unique and fascinating in its rise in popularity in our culture, which is the issue of what's called the Christ myth. For those of you who don't know it, I'll introduce it to you. And what I'm going to do this week is do 2 ideas together. We're going to hit the Christ myth question, but also the question of the legitimacy of the Bible. And the reason we're going to kind of collapse those 2 in together is because they're kind of the same issue. If the Christ myth is true, then the Bible is not true. And if the Bible is true, then the Christ myth is not true. This is literally like Mayweather and McGregor, all right, up against each other. That one was for the millennials. It's 2 boxers, all right, fighting each other, and there's only going to be one left standing. If the Bible's legit, if we can trust it, which I'm going to try to show historically we can, then the Christ myth is actually completely false. If the Christ myth is true, then the Bible's not. And so what is the Christ myth about? We got a lot of work to do today, and hopefully you understand that the point of this series is to really get into the mind of skeptics and people who push against Christianity. And maybe that's you. Awesome. Really glad that you're here. Sincerely, we love you as a church. This is why we do series like this. For some of you, it might feel like a technical series with lots of quotes and data, but we need to come at this stuff from a scientific perspective, historical perspective, philosophical perspective, psychological. We need to get into these things and these disciplines and understand first that it equips you, even if you're already a Christian, a follower of Jesus, to understand how to defend your faith, which is part of the biblical idea. First Peter talks about that idea of being able to defend your faith at any moment. But also you got to understand that this is what the world around you believes. This is what your family believes, your friends believe, the university teaches. And so we need to understand that this is real life all around you in the coffee shops and the malls and the pubs and where you live your life. This is how real people think. And if you're going to be able to understand, to answer and engage them, then you've got to understand this data. So understand that not every series is as technical or heavy as the series we're in right now, but there's really a necessity to stop at times and do series like this. So we got a lot of work to do, specifically historical work today. So hopefully you've had your coffee. We're going to jump into this. First question is, or your Red Bull or whatever it is. First question is, what is the Christ myth? What is this thing? And really we got to understand that it's really the biggest conspiracy theory in the history of the world. And it's basically this, that Jesus Christ never actually existed. That what happened is the early church came together and created Jesus out of mythologies that predated Christianity. Mythologies that came from Egypt and the Greco-Roman cultures and the Hindu cultures that were thousands of years before Jesus. They looked up at the stars, they saw the constellations, and they created cosmic Messiah stories of virgin births and kings that came to the birth of this cosmic Messiah. This cosmic Messiah had 12 disciples and fed 5,000 people and walked on water, died on a cross, raised 3 days after he died. All of that was long before Jesus, and all Jesus Christ is a guy the early church came up with and said, let's reappropriate these ancient myths and create a new Messiah, and we'll just make up a religion. All right, that's the idea. And it's very popular, and it's a conspiracy theory that Christianity is the greatest story ever sold, that we're just making this up, we're trying to fool everybody. And I have a buddy I was talking to the other day, and it was September 11th, so we were talking about September 11th, and he goes, oh yeah, September 11th, those planes didn't really go in those buildings. They set detonation and they collapsed those buildings. It was all controlled demolition and an inside job. I'm like, oh, so you're crazy, right? So what we got to understand is conspiracy theories are so interesting because people attach themselves to them, right? JFK, was shot by multiple people, and Lee Harvey Oswald was a patsy, and UFOs came down in Roswell, New Mexico, and we've never been to the moon. And Stanley Kubrick, when he did The Shining, it's a film basically with a built-in confession that he just filmed the moon landing, and it's all a joke, and we're just trying to fool everybody that we got there because JFK said we'd get there by the end of the decade, and so we had to. So it was, 1969, so we made it up. We put it in the studio. All of this stuff, the X-Files, right? I want to believe, right? That's kind of what's embedded in us, is this sense of, I don't want to just take what's in front of me as natural. I want to create a conspiracy theory. Now, how popular is this? The Christ conspiracy is very popular all over the place, on university campuses. I walk down the streets of Vancouver and people are there with booths handing this stuff out. I walked up to my neighbor a short time ago and I was sharing Christ with him, and he said, listen, I know you're a pastor. I know you try to do good for people, but the reality is your religion is the greatest story ever sold, and here's why. And he starts to unpack like he'd read the script, man. Horus had 12 disciples. Horus was this. Dionysus, Mithras, Krishna, virgin birth, but all this is born on December 25th. I'm like, oh man, this is like we're having our coffee. I'm like, this is too early for this, all right? So this is like regular stuff. I want to show, Bill Maher had a movie called Religious. I'm not sure anyone saw it, but he put it out a bunch of years ago, and here's a scene from that movie unpacking. Of course, he goes to the Holy Land experience, the Christian theme park in Orlando, Florida, the kind of the pinnacle of Christian thought and philosophy. He goes there and he starts talking to people who are there, and there's a guy dressed up like Jesus because he's putting on the Passion Play at 4 p.m. or whatever he's doing. And he talks to him and he unpacks this. So I'm going to show you that clip so you kind of understand what the framework of the Christ myth is in pop culture.
Going around the Mediterranean for at least 1,000 years. We've got Krishna, who was in India 1,000 years before Christ. Krishna was a carpenter, born of a virgin, baptized in the river.
You might say that was written in history. That was written down in history.
Absolutely. It was the virgin god Mithras 600 years before Christ. Born December 25th, performed miracles, resurrected the third day, known as the Lamb, the way, the truth, the light, the Savior, the Messiah.
All I know is that I can go by that accuracy. That's I go by the word of God. No, it's not.
Well, I believe it.
Okay, yes.
It's not that it's not.
It's the truth in what you believe.
But the Bible tells us that all things are possible.
Studying the religions of the Mediterranean region for 1,000 years before, many of the gods were born on December 25th. It's not a new.
It's not. It's not.
It's funny you should bring that up because, of course, Star Wars Episode 1 Anakin is born to a virgin. And people see that and they say, wait a second, where have we heard that before? That's not original. When did you first start? How so?
Excellent.
Let me ask you, let's say, if you take a side that this is all made up.
I do.
Oh, no, it wasn't over, I don't think. Is that where it ended? Oh, I think there was, okay, don't worry about it. Okay, so anyways, there's a whole bunch of other data that comes out of that clip, and it goes through a bunch of different Christian, different people. So here's the first question. Did Jesus Christ really exist, historically speaking? Now, a bunch of months ago, I watched an actual clip of Buzz Aldrin, who was one of the first guys. He actually went with Neil Armstrong to the moon. And a guy walked up to him and he said, "Hey, Buzz Aldrin, the moon landing was a hoax. It never actually happened." And Buzz Aldrin was sitting there and he's like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "You guys set it up. You know, it was a big propaganda piece. It was a conspiracy." And Buzz Aldrin just punched the guy in the face, all right, which was a perfect response to a bunk conspiracy, all right? So spiritually speaking, that's what we should all do when it comes to this kind of stuff. So the first question is, did Jesus Christ actually exist? And on the level of conspiracy theories, the idea that Jesus never actually existed is on the level of we never actually went to the moon. One writer, Edwin Yamauchi, a professor of history at Miami University, says this: "Any argument that challenges the claim of a historical Jesus is so ridiculous in the scholarly community, it is relegated only to the world of footnotes." Now, the reason he says this is because there's a whole bunch of reasons. First one off the bat is historians tell us that there's at least 10 people that were not biblical, so outside of the Bible, who mention Jesus Christ in history. So these are people who weren't necessarily friends of Christianity. They were first century historians. Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, and so on. So let me give you a couple of examples. This is outside the Bible, people who are even against Christianity that mention Jesus. So here's Tacitus. Here's what he says: "Nero fastened the guilt," he's talking about a fire that happened in Rome, "on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilatus." All right, Josephus says this: "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day, he appeared restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared." And so what you got to understand is people looked into this story and they said Jesus actually existed. He died under Pontius Pilate. There's a ton of historical reference points to the point of Christianity. Even Bart Ehrman, who was a Christian and became an agnostic, who studied this time, said, of course Jesus actually existed. This is there is more evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ than the founder of any religion on the planet. In human history and humankind's experience of developing religion and philosophy, there is more actual evidence that Jesus existed. Now, here's a second issue around the question of did Jesus exist? The rise of the early church is actually a massive problem if Jesus never really existed, because here you have a movement that actually moved so quick, and it was a group of people who said, not only did Jesus exist, he died on the cross, but he rose from death, and we worship him. And it wasn't a group of people who kind of came up with this without implication for their life, where they just said, "Oh, I've got some teachings of Jesus and now nothing bad's happening to me." They started to get persecuted. And one thing that happened is they started to get ripped apart by lions, thrown into gladiatorial arenas. Their kids were killed. And so they suffered immense pressure. This was a group of people who would then go out and take care of people who were sick and actually get the disease themselves and die because, as history looks back, they weren't afraid of death. And the only explanation for the reason they weren't afraid of death, why they were willing to face torture and never recanted their testimony that they saw the risen Jesus, not like a few people, hundreds of them, And then thousands of them into and then millions of them into year 200, 300 AD. 50% of the Roman Empire became people. What happened? Historians look back and go, there's no explanation. Because if a group of people just get together, nobody dies for a lie that they made up. No one dies for a lie that you say. You might die for a lie you think is true, but not one that you came together with a group of people and said, hey, let's come up with a lie. Let's actually lie about this, and let's just make up a religion. What happens? The minute you start getting fried on a pan, which is what happened to people, the minute they start ripping your fingernails out, threatening to kill your children, sawing your body in half, you kind of go, okay, we made it up. But none of these people did. And history looks back and goes, there's no better explanation than these people actually saw their leader rise from death, that they saw him crucified, that 3 days later they saw him raised from death, and the early church actually took off from there. I was reading a book about conspiracies, and this one guy talked about the idea. He's an ex-homicide detective. And he goes in and he investigates murders. And he says, here's the issue after 30, 40 years of being a homicide detective, as you're studying evidence for what happened in a particular situation. He said, issue number one is you always have to resist a conspiracy theory. Because most of the time, it's what it looks like. You constantly, as a detective, have to resist when people come in and go, but what if this happened? And what if this group? And the reason he said you have to always resist a conspiracy theory is because conspiracy theories are very rare by definition. There's not a lot of them that actually can be pulled off. And the reason is because what you need for a conspiracy theory to work is you need a limited amount of people. He said ideally 2 people involved, and once the deed is done, you kill the other one. Right? That's the best way a conspiracy actually works. Because the minute 2 people know about it, bad things are gonna happen. Secondly, you need really good forms of communication. And thirdly, you can't be applied any pressure, or the conspiracy theory will break really quickly. Now let me give you an example that illustrates all 3 of these things. I was golfing about a month ago with 3 of my buddies, okay? So we arrive at the golf course and it's wet. And those of you who are golfers know that when you get a cart, you wanna be able to pull up to your ball and be near your ball. But this day they said, you can't go on the fairways, it's too wet, you gotta stay on the cart path. Now, one of my buddies, a bunch of years ago, he got in an accident on his bike, and his motorbike, not his bicycle. And he had multiple surgeries, was 6 months in a wheelchair. He has ankles that are all made of steel and screws and all that kind of stuff. So I said to my other buddy, I said, well, he's not here yet. Why don't we make sure we can go and we get the handicap flag? Because they'll take a flag, it's a big orange flag, and they'll put it on your cart if you're handicapped, and then you can drive right up to the ball. So I said, why don't we get that? And so he goes, oh, okay, that's a good idea. So the guy went in, he said, hey, my buddy's handicapped. Can you get us that flag? And he's like, yeah, sure, I'll bring it out. So we're all sitting over here and my buddy arrives and he's on the phone. And so we're over here getting drinks and getting ready to go. And he's on the phone and we're like, hey, you're handicapped. And he's like, what? And he keeps talking like this. And so we're over here and he's standing there and a guy walks out with the flag. And he's like, he gets off the phone, he's like, hey, what are you doing? He's like, oh, this is your flag. He's like, what do I need? What's the flag? What do you mean the flag? He's like, oh, because you're handicapped. And he's like, do I look handicapped? He screams at the guy, and the guy's standing there, and he's like, I'm really sorry, sir. And then he goes back inside, and my buddy's like, what's going on here? He's like, 2 minutes later, I come around the corner, I'm like, where's the flag? He's like, what flag? I'm like, the handicap flag. He's like, I said, you're handicapped. He's like, I'm handicapped? I'm like, yes, you need to be. He's like, oh, shoot. So he goes back into the pro shop. He's like, oh, you said handicapped. Yeah, that's me. Totally, right? The issue is you need very clear lines of communication. You all need to be on the same page. You need to have no pressure applied at all. And of course, the early church gets all this pressure applied. They actually die believing this stuff. And so history has looked back to the rise of the early church and said, something actually happened here. Now, let's get into the issues of the comparison of these Horus things and all of that kind of stuff. First off, the people who promote the Christ myth, whether it's a Chara S in her book, The Christ Conspiracy, Tom Harper, just to let you know how popular this is, Tom Harper wrote a book called The Pagan Christ. It was the best-selling book in Canada in 2004. The best-selling book in Canada in 2004 was a book about the Christ myth. That's what Canadians actually think about. And so there's a movie called Zeitgeist, The God Who Wasn't There. These are all the popular frameworks of this theory. Now, they get facts wrong. For instance, Zeitgeist makes this claim about the symbolic number 12, and it says Christianity built all of its symbolism of 12 based on the 12-month calendar and the zodiac, and it says, quote, in the Bible, there are 12 tribes of Israel, 12 princes, 12 kings, and 12 judges. So here's what we just need to slow down the tape. I know it's less sexy to do that, but we need to slow down the tape and actually get into facts. The Bible has a couple of instances for sure where there's 12. There's 12 tribes of Israel. And then, of course, Jesus gets 12 disciples based off the 12 tribes of Israel. But it never mentions any 12 princes. There's no 12 princes. There's no 12 kings. There's no 12 judges. There's far more kings and far more judges than that. Secondly, it talks about the idea that Horus had 12 disciples. The reality is, most of these writers don't deal with any of the primary sources. They never go to Egypt and look at the hieroglyphs. They just cite each other. And so they say, look, Horus had 12 disciples. Then you look into Achara S.'s book, The Christ Conspiracy, and you go to her footnote, and all she's doing is quoting George Massey. She's not quoting hieroglyphs. She's just quoting another guy who said the same thing. The problem is that on the hieroglyphs, Horus only had 4 disciples, a turtle, a bear, a lion, and a tiger. All right, so the reality is the 4 people hanging around Horus does not actually equal a parallel. But are there parallels? So let's get into some of these massive claims of the parallels with Christianity. First, let's deal with Horus. He's the most popular ancient god that predates Christianity in this debate. So here's what they say about him. First, that he was born of a virgin. Was Horus born of a virgin? If you get into the stories of Horus, here's how Horus was actually conceived. His mother's name was Isis. His father's name was Osiris. Here's how Isis conceived of Horus. Osiris was in a fight with another god. He got cut up. Isis then came over his body parts, which were cut up on the ground, and she hovered over his severed phallus, and that's how she got impregnated to actually say, hey, now I'm pregnant and I can have Horus. Now, I'm not sure that's considered a virgin conception. All right. Secondly, it says not only was he born of a virgin, he was born on December 25th. And of course, everyone freaks out, oh my goodness. But of course, you and I know as Christians, that's not a parallel with Christianity because, and I don't want to ruin anybody's Christmas, but I'm about to, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. Historians tell us he was probably born sometime in September or October. The reason we celebrate it is because just before 400 AD, Pope Julius I changed when Christians celebrate Christianity in order to subvert a Roman worship of God, the Saturnalia celebration of her birth. Now, the reality is Christianity comes along and says, listen, December 25th, that's not a thing. We don't care about that. That's not a parallel. Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. Now, here's another issue. 3 kings who attended the birth of this cosmic Messiah. What do we do with that? Well, the reality is Christianity doesn't ever teach that 3 kings. Where they get this is they look up in Orion's belt and they see 3 stars and then there's a lead star. And so that's obviously been up there for a while. And people say, look, Christianity just borrowed this thing and made it up about Jesus. Here's the problem with that. First, no one talked about those 3 stars following a lead star until about the 18th or 19th century. All right, so no one talked about those 3 stars as 3 kings following a lead star to a birth of a cosmic Messiah until 200 or 300 years ago from now. The second issue is Christianity, again, I don't want to ruin anyone's Christmas, doesn't teach that 3 kings followed a star and arrived at the birth of Jesus. That's not what Christianity teaches. I know we dress our kids up in their little robes and we go out there, Tommy, be a king. And he's like, hey, I'm at the birth of Jesus. That's not actually what happened. You have to understand, the only story about anyone arriving at the birth of Jesus in the Gospels is in Luke's Gospel, and they're shepherds, that where the angels come and they arrive at the birth of Jesus. The Matthew narrative is about a group of people who arrive when Jesus is probably 2 years old because they arrive in the house and they come to see the child, not the baby in the Greek, and it's probably a toddler. And it doesn't say there was 3 of them. And it doesn't say they were kings. It says they were magi, which were Babylonian and Persian magicians. And it says that they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So us and all our creativity go, well, one guy must have been carrying the gold. The other guy had the frankincense, and the other guy had the myrrh. And so there must have been 3. The Bible never tells us how many there were. There could have been 5. There could have been 40. We have no idea. And they weren't at the birth of Jesus anyway. And so these aren't even parallels. December 25th, not a parallel. 3 kings at the birth of Jesus, not a parallel. So what we got to start to understand is they actually get their facts wrong. What about Horus being crucified and resurrected on the 3rd day? You get into the story of Horus. Most of the stories of Horus don't have him dying at all. The one that does, he dies and he falls into the water. He gets chopped up. Seems to be a theme back in these old stories. They like chopping people up. Falls into the water, and then he gets fished out by some crocodiles. And that's considered a resurrection parallel. So that's what we're talking about right now. In people's brains, when they say Jesus has a parallel with Horus, that's what they're talking about. Now, secondly, let's look at Mithras for a couple minutes. Born on December 25th, obviously not a parallel with Jesus. Shepherds attended his birth, and he was virgin born. The reality is Mithras was actually born fully formed out of a rock. And so I'm not necessarily saying anything about the sexual activity of a rock. I'm just saying I'm not sure the rock was a virgin to give birth to Mithras, all right? But this is the kind of dumb parallels we're talking about. Why would that be a virgin birth? Because he was born from a rock. Oh, good point, Tony. Anyway, the whole Mithras idea was dated 200 years after the Gospels were written anyway, so most historians say that the whole Mithras cult was borrowing from Christianity. Let's deal with the last one here, and then we'll move on. They cite Attis, and Attis died, they said. He had a death and a resurrection. But here was the nature of Attis's resurrection. After Aegisthus, his father, caused his son to die, I won't tell you how, you can look it up later, it's too PG-13 for church. He died, and then his father went to Zeus and said, can you resurrect my son from the dead? And Zeus said, of course not, because resurrection is not a thing, but I will let Attis's pinky finger move eternally and his hair will grow forever. That's considered resurrection in their parallels. So that's what we're talking about. Once you get into the data. Now, I've rhymed this off before, but I'll do it for you, and it's in my book as well. But it's something called, Craig Evans, who's a historian, talks about parallelomania. And he says if you just hone in on certain information, you can equate 2 things that have nothing to do with each other very easily. And he talks about the contrast of JFK and Abraham Lincoln. So I'll give it to you. He says this: both men were concerned with civil rights. Both were elected to Congress in 1846 and 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy in 1960. Both were slain on a Friday before a major holiday. Both were shot in the presence of their wives and in the presence of another couple. Of the other couple, the man was wounded, but neither wife was. Both were shot from behind in the head. Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater in Box 7. Kennedy was shot in Car 7 of the Dallas motorcade. Both were pronounced dead at a location with the initials PH, Peterson House and Parkland Hospital. The successors of both men were named Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908. Both assassins were privates in the military. John Wilkes Booth, 3 names, was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald, 3 names, was born in 1939. Booth fled from a theater to a library. Oswald fled from a library to a theater. Both assassins were taken into custody by a police officer named Baker. Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Ford car. The model of the Ford was a Lincoln. How is that possible? Now, nobody says that JFK didn't exist because of all these parallels. It's a dumb argument. Because here's what we have to do. We have to start understanding. You can isolate certain information and probably get anything out of it. A friend of mine looks exactly like my wife. And she said a couple months ago, she was out for dinner with her husband, and the waitress was acting very weird to her. And she didn't understand why. And she later found out that the waitress had been texting all night, and the story was that my wife, Erin, was out for dinner with another man. Because they looked that similar. And so the story started to spread around her friends. The pastor's wife is sitting here with a man. I can't believe she's out with another man. Much less good-looking man. Much less strong, bulked up man. I can't believe, why would she do this trade? You can isolate information and get anything you want out of it. So here's the deal. We got to start to look at now, this is not to claim, and here's a very important point. What do Christians do with this? This is not to claim that there weren't some parallels to Christianity that predate Christianity. Of course there were. Now, but what we got to understand is how we approach those. Justin Martyr, who was writing way back in the day, he was talking about Christianity, and he says this. He said, when we say that the Word, who is the firstborn birth of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem sons of Jupiter. So he's talking to people who are involved in paganism. And he says, listen, Christianity came along after you, and I understand there are parallels to it. One of the ideas, actually, St. Augustine, he wrote this. He said, the very thing which is now, sorry, I'm just trying to move a quote here. The very thing which is now called the Christian religion existed before. It was not absent from the beginning of the human race until Christ himself came in the flesh, but it was then that the true religion that already existed began to be called Christian. It's this concept of a pre-Christian Christianity. In Colossians chapter 2, Paul says this, therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Basically what he's saying is there were anticipations of the Christ story in human history built into the fabric of the kinds of stories we told long before Christianity and the gospel actually came on the world. But it was so God had built it into cultures, we told this story to ourselves until it became true, until we could say, now this actually happened in history, historically. It's not an esoteric story. It's not a metaphor. This is what you got to understand. When the Apostle Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians 15, and he's saying, listen, if the resurrection didn't happen, we are to be the most pitied of people because we're all getting killed for this thing. We're all getting ripped apart for this thing. He's not sitting around coming up with a religion about esoteric philosophical ideas. He's saying this really happened. This was a historical person, and if he didn't exist, then we're to be the most pitied of people in the world because we're dying for nothing. There are Christ myth proponents who say, oh, the Apostle Paul, he didn't care about history. That's why he doesn't ever talk about the birth of Jesus. He only talks about Jesus, the Christ, the mystical one, the one you can connect to spiritually. That's why he never talks about the birth. He never talks about how many disciples he had. Listen, that is to misunderstand Paul's whole point. He says, if this guy didn't really live, really die, and really raise from death, we're to be the most pitied of all people. The Apostle Paul cared about history more than anybody. If we just came up with him, we're in a lot of trouble. And so here's what C.S. Lewis said, who studied all of these myths before he became a Christian. And then he became a Christian. And here's what he said. He said, the old myth of the dying God comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date in a particular place. From Osiris dying, nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified. It's all in order. Under Pontius Pilate, it says, Christ is more than Osiris, not less. We must not be ashamed of the parallels. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. Those who do not know that this great myth became fact when the virgin conceived are indeed to be pitied. So here's what we got to understand. It makes sense that these stories had rhythms and patterns before Christianity ever came about. So if the Christ myth isn't true, that clears the way for the Bible to be true. And here's what you and I have to start to understand, that historically speaking, skeptics come at the Bible and say, no, the Bible's not true, and I'll tell you why. It was changed too much. It was written too far. When I'm sitting with people and they're challenging the Bible, this is what they claim, right? It was made up, it was legend, it was written too far after the fact, it was changed all over the place. Here's what we got to understand. First, most historians recognize that the Old Testament and the New Testament are the most trusted documents in antiquity. Out of any documents that were going around spreading ideas, Christianity, the Old Testament, the New Testament was founded, and it's to be the most trusted documents actually in history. Were the documents ever changed? That's a question. They weren't, and here's how we know. There's been documents of Isaiah. There's all kinds of pagan documents where you find one and it was written 200 years after that one. It's found in another geographical location, and they're just totally different stories, totally different teachings. And so what they found is scrolls of Isaiah written 800 years apart in two totally different geographic regions of the world. And what blew them away is that it was exactly the same. 95% of the text was exactly the same, which actually caused Gleason Archer, who's a historian, to say that this is actually the most, I can't believe that there were no changes. He says when they found the scrolls and the Dead Sea in 1947, it was 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscripts previously known, and they proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. And so there's people who go, okay, fine, I get it, Old Testament was intact, because you gotta understand, these guys cared about the writing of the text, right? You know when you're reading the Gospels and it said there's scribes and Pharisees? You know what the scribe's job was? To sit around and copy text, but they weren't doing it alone in a room. They had two guys over their shoulders, and every time they made a little mistake, they would have to mark it and initial it and then move forward. It wasn't some guy in a dark room who just walked out. He's like, okay, here's Isaiah, everyone. Anyone want to read it? I just wrote it. It's like there was scribe, and this is why the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's no differences between these things. Now, there's some skeptics who say, yeah, but what about all the disputed passages? The New Testament's not legitimate. I can't read that. All the disputed passages, all the contradictions, all the mistakes all over the New Testament, you can't trust it. There's people who build a life on going around lecturing this stuff. Here's what you gotta understand. There are literally two passages in your New Testament that scholars actually say probably weren't part of the original manuscripts, all right? One of them is at the end of the Gospel of Mark 16, and you can kind of tell because Jesus starts talking about people being bitten by snakes, and it's like, I don't know if it really sounds like Jesus. And the other one is actually John 8, 1-11, which is kind of sad for most people because it's the story of the woman caught in adultery. You know the story where they bring her and he starts drawing on the ground? The reality is most scholars, conservative scholars would say that was not originally part of the Gospel of John at all. Now, Christianity is not trying to hide this. Any Bible you open, it says it right above the story. This was not part of the original manuscripts. I talked to skeptics who are like, hey, I found, because I was on the internet the other day, because I live in my parents' basement and I spent a lot of time on Reddit in my PJs, and I found out that John 8 wasn't original. Ha, I've got you. It's like, it says it in my Bible, dude. Right above the story. Now, what about the contradictions? I've shared some of these before. People say, well, you don't understand all the contradictions. Okay, what are the contradictions? Contradictions. Did Judas, one passage says Judas killed himself. The other passage says that his bowels just spilled out all over the ground. Right, those don't contradict each other. He hung himself, over time the rope broke and his bowels spilled out all over the ground. What's the difference? People say, okay, fine, but what about the angels? In one gospel, the gospel writer says there was two angels there, and another one says that there was one angel there. No, one gospel tells us that one spoke, the other one told us there was two there. This gospel over here was only interested in the one talking. He was not interested in how many angels were there. This one was actually interested in how many angels were there. Now, let me tell you one that I haven't really shared with you before that I think is very fascinating. And I've had this in debates with people as well. They point out that the Gospel of Mark in the first verse is actually a mistake, and that's why you shouldn't trust it. And here's the example. So the Gospel of Mark, I'm gonna put this on the screen for you. Mark chapter 1, verse 1 reads this way, and you can look it up in your Bible later. It says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, quote, behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. Now, here's what skeptics point out. When he says Isaiah the prophet, the problem is, behold, I send my messenger is actually a quote from Malachi, or as my friend likes to say, Malachi, the Italian prophet. That's actually a quote from Malachi. So, we have a mistake in the Bible. He says he's quoting Isaiah, and then he quotes Malachi, throw the Gospel of Mark out. Now, That for years and years was actually recognized as a mistake in the Bible. But here's what scholars point out. Lots of scholars have done amazing work in regard to the book of Mark. And what they realize is when you're reading the book of Mark, the whole book is actually, there's not probably a chapter in the whole Gospel of Mark that doesn't quote Isaiah. And all the themes of Mark are coming through what scholars call Isaiah's new Exodus, showing Jesus as the new Moses leading about the new Exodus. And what scholars point out is the better way to probably read this grammatically, because remember, there was no commas or periods or quotation marks back in the day. It's just all letters, like a big strand. That the better way to actually read Mark chapter 1, verse 1 is this way. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Stop, colon. Then he starts his whole book, meaning read my entire gospel as if it's presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of the book of Isaiah. Stop thought. Then he starts his book and he quotes Malachi, right? And he starts in Malachi and he goes, he's not making a mistake. He's saying, read the next 16 chapters, read them as a reframing of the book of Isaiah. Read Jesus through the filter of the prophet Isaiah. Done my thought. That's the opening thought of the entire gospel. Now go and read the next 16 chapters. See, here's what we got to understand. The Bible over and over and over again shows itself to be true when we fumble it. And we do fumble it. This is why archaeologists say, you don't understand. There's never been anything in a biblical claim that has been actually proven false in regard to archaeology. Sir Frederick G. Kenyon, the former director of the British Museum, says this way: in no other case is the interval, oh no, sorry, that's the wrong quote. I was gonna be talking about manuscripts. Here, Nelson Glueck, a renowned Jewish archaeologist. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever contradicted a biblical reference. Out of all the archaeological things that can be said, I remember there were years in the early 1900s at universities where they would teach that John chapter 5 wasn't real because it said that there were 5 roofed colonnades in this particular area, and they'd done their digging and they never found any. And so they just made fun of the Bible, punched it and said, don't, and people graduated and lived their life and died and said, I don't believe in the Bible. And then a few years later, they dug a little deeper and they found exactly what John chapter 5 explains. I've been there. I've stood there and touched those colonnades and almost started crying because I thought about the generations of people who punched their Bible and said, I don't believe in this stuff. And then they just dug a little deeper and they found that archaeology vindicates the Bible over and over and over again. Now, why do people actually trust it? Because there's 2 things when you're looking into manuscripts, New Testament manuscripts. There's 2 things you look for in regard to legitimacy. The first is the number of manuscripts that you have so you can compare mistakes. And the second is how long after the events they actually took place. And so let me give you a little bit of context to this. And I talk about this in the book as well, if you need to reference this. So outside of the New Testament, here's the number of manuscripts that other works of antiquity had that people looked at and fully trust. Thucydides reported in his writings as historically accurate. In existence, he had 8 copies, the earliest transcribed 1,300 years after the events of which he wrote. 8 copies of his work, and historians say this is legit. This is factual. We trust Thucydides. Aristotle's Poetics. There's 5 copies dated 1,400 years after the originals. Caesar's Gallic Wars. There's 3 manuscripts from 1,000 years after his death. What about the New Testament? The New Testament has 25,000 copies of it, way beyond anything that anybody trusts in the ancient world. And how long were they written after the fact? 15 to 25 years after, which means there was not a lot of room for mythology and legend to actually get built into the stories. That's the beautiful part of it. The earlier they're actually written, think about it, 25 years after the fact. Go back to 1992. See, here's why people trust it. Because those documents were written in such a way that eyewitnesses were still alive. When you're writing something 25 years after the fact, everyone could have said, no, I was there. He never fed 5,000 people. Those pigs never got drowned like that. He never walked on water. I had an uncle who was there. What you need to do if you're starting a religion, and this is what happened with Islam, this is what happened with Buddhism, this is what happened with Hinduism, you wait until all the eyewitnesses are dead, and then you can claim anything you want want. You can claim miracles all you want because no one was around. But in the New Testament, he's claiming stuff and everyone's still alive, which means those copies never would have gone anywhere. The New Testament would have been passed. People would have gone, no, I was there. That never really happened. And it's dead. It never goes anywhere. These guys weren't afraid. They're like, go ask people. Go ask people whether this actually happened. The interval, think about it, 1992, that's 25 years ago. Can you remember your life in 1992? 1992, that's when Clinton got into office. That's when the Blue Jays won their first of 2 World Series in a row. Holla, all right? All right, 1992, I remember who I was dating. I remember everything about now imagine I wrote a book today and I said, that was a really difficult nuclear war we got into in 1992 with America, but it all turned out in the end. You would go, that never happened. What are you talking about? I remember it. I remembered Silence of the Lambs, won Best Picture that year, right? Clarice, right? There's like I remember that. Like you can't claim that something happened. I was just there. And this is why scholars go, man, the New Testament wouldn't move an inch because it says, go ask these people. Jesus resurrected, showed himself to 500 people. Go ask them because they're still alive. The reality is people look and they go, man, the New Testament's actually, the fact that there were women at the resurrection, at a time when the women actually arrived first, at the most important historical moment of Christianity, at a time where a woman's testimony wasn't even allowed in a court of law. Christianity over and over and over again shows itself to be legitimate in regard to the documents. Now, here's the issue at the end of the day. Personally, I think what we got to understand is this. I want you guys to trust the Bible. And if you're a skeptic and you're exploring Christianity, here's what you got to understand. Do you want to know how I encounter? Augustine said the Bible is the face of God for us now. Here's the power of it. When I was a 17-year-old kid, it took me 2 or 3 years to ever walk into a church, which means I met God in a very powerful way long before I ever came into a church. And where I met him was the Bible. I didn't know anything about Christianity. I didn't have mentors in my life. I didn't have community. I didn't have pastors. What I would do was I would go out and smoke a pack of cigarettes and read the Bible. And I encountered the power of it actually changed me. Like these words, Isaiah says, my word will not return back to me void. That when you let it, here's the problem. You're judging, if you're a skeptic, you judge the New Testament or the Old Testament, but you haven't even read it. And when you read it, read the Gospels, read the Gospel of Mark, read Matthew, which we've been preaching through for 4 years. Read it and the encounter, I actually encountered the God behind the Bible when I read it. I would sit out with a friend named Heather, and she was a Wiccan witch, all right? She would be dressed all in black, and I'd be sitting out there in my little khakis and my polo, and I would smoke a pack of cigarettes and read the Bible, and she'd be like, hey, you should go to Summerland. And I'm like, bah. And I'd read the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus would just say something, and I'd do it. Hey, man, if somebody asks you for your cloak, give them your shirt as well. And I just somebody asked me for a cigarette. Here, take the whole pack. Let me get you a carton. Jesus wants you to have it. All right, he told me to give it to you. Because all I had was the Bible. I'm honestly telling you, right? Yeah, get through all this data, whatever. We have to do that. We had to do that in order to understand why people are compelled to come against Christianity from a historical perspective. Fine, that might not be your thing. Here's what you got to understand. Give the Bible a shot, because what you're going to find, you will meet God in it. I'm telling you this. He took me from a 17-year-old kid, a drug kid, throwing rocks through windows, stealing from cars to get money to buy more drugs, hanging out, just a nonsense life. No idea where my life was going. Probably to a very bad place. And I encountered him for 2 years just reading this. And then I just started to get on fire. And I started walking around my town. And I would just I'd go at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'd be going, this woman would be crying on her porch. Now it feels creepy, but I would just walk up to her and go, can I pray for you, lady? Boom, and I just start praying for her. All right, now I'd be arrested. And I just pray for her that she would take feel the peace and the mercy of Jesus. I remember preaching to a group of people and just having a Bible and saying, listen, you guys are half hammered, but you need to meet Jesus. A guy accepts Christ. He said, I want to be baptized right now. And I baptized him in Lake Ontario at 2 a.m. I wasn't even baptized yet. Like, that's not even theologically correct. There's nothing about that should work. Everything about that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact I met him. This is trusted. This is powerful. Every word of it is true. Old Testament, New Testament. From a liberal standpoint and conservative standpoint, most scholars agree this is the most trusted text in antiquity. You compare it, you trust it, feel the weight of it, give it a shot, and it will show, as it does. Christ myth, false. The myth becoming fact in history, true and powerful. And the question becomes, do you let that then shake you and give your life to it? Let me just pray for us. Father, I am grateful for your grace. I'm grateful that you actually came and fulfilled a story that seemed to be just getting written in the human heart, and human culture was crying out through these stories for God to actually come and fulfill this. A divine person who dies and rises again to redeem us. And I just pray that the reality of that fact, that you actually did it, and it's not a story, that people died for it and continue to die for it today. I pray that we would actually be confronted with the reality of it, and we would give our lives to it. And you do a powerful work, that we would meet you through the legitimacy of the Bible, the weight of it, your word to us, the face for us of you now. And we let it confront us and change us, whether we've been Christians our whole life or we're just exploring this thing. Do that work among us. In Jesus' great name we pray. Amen.